Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So the intro montage for this one, I went ahead and made the Mark II look more like a car again. The fenders are on for good, the bumper is mocked up for the time being so I could get measurements for the intercooler core, and I went ahead and measured for the radiator core as well. So we'll get those on the way in the near future, and then we can proceed with the rest or the next step of this turbo system. But that aside, today I went ahead, but I received the turbine flange. So pretty nice piece. It's set up with a receiver on this side for 2.5-inch tubing. The other side is just flat. And this will work quite well with our tight radius 2.5-inch merge, and all should be well with that. And I figured out, luckily enough, that with my T3, T4, T6 purge block, we actually do line up reasonably well with the holes on this flange. So I can go ahead and use the purge block to actually back purge this as I'm welding it up, and all should work well that way. So let me get some fasteners and get the flange cleaned up the way that I want it, and then we can get to making the collector and the flange one piece and move on to the next step of this. Mark II's secondary collector is now welded up. So let's go over some of the details on it. And right there, I scuffed it a little bit. Thankfully, that is on the non-visible side. Still kind of unfortunate, but it is what it is. So beyond the negative, let's talk about the positive. So we have a nice 2-into-1 going down to the turbine flange. I welded it with a combination of 347 stainless filler, which is the correct filler to use with 321 stainless, and silicon bronze as a cap to it. So I like the way that silicon bronze looks. I think it's cool, and it's the old school header builder's way to weld headers and weld tubes to flanges, I should say. So beyond that, you can see the back side here. You can see I have time certs. And looking at it from this side, I have time certs in all 4 of the holes. And this flange came without threaded holes. Now, normally this wouldn't be a big issue, but due to the tight confines, as you can kind of see where my pinky is right here, it would be difficult to get a nut in there and to tighten that down. And I wanted threaded holes, so I made it so it has threaded holes. And I stitch welded them on the back side here because they sit a little bit prouder. A couple of them sit a little bit proud to the face of the flange down underneath of here. And as I sit and actually plane this flange down, I didn't want to have no retention method I didn't want to eliminate the retention method rather, that is the shoulder on a time cert. As I sand everything down, more than likely we'll take those shoulders off, at least a couple of them, and I didn't want to deal with ending up pulling the threaded inserts out. So now we have threaded holes, we have a secondary collector that's finished aside from a final sanding, and this thing is ready to go into service. So with the collector loosely put in place on here, we can see that, yeah, it's going to be very tight, but I think I should be able to make it work. And one note about fixtures, whenever you are building a fixture that things need to be in a repeatable place, these countersunk fasteners are very handy. So you can see it has kind of a tapered conical underside to the head, and as you tighten these fasteners down through the holes on a flange, or this is a good example of it right here, tightening down the secondary collector to the turbine flange plate. That cone will pull down directly centered in the hole, provided that you do have a reasonably circular hole that you're working with. And if you tighten down in the same spots every time, then the pieces of your part will be tightened down in the same location every time. Well, we now have all of the tubing for the Mark II's new turbo header, as you guys can tell from that little montage there. And we are ready to do some cutting and some fitting and some welding now. So we're going to work with the straight tubing up there to start, but just to do a once over of everything that we have two 2-inch to 2.5-inch transitional cones, these two right here. We have 12-inch-and-a-half short radius bends with a leg on each one of them. We have 5 2.5-inch bends with legs on them, and again, tight radius. And then we have 8 feet of 1.5-inch straight tubing. So all of this stuff in the for the rest of this video and the next upcoming ones will be used to build the new turbo header for the Mark II. But like I said, today we're going to focus on the straight tube and cutting the two primary collectors. Another cool thing from the crew at Tycon and Stainless Bros are these. They sent out these markers, and you can see that they are permanent markers for marking almost everything. And they also have each of their companies on here as well. So green is Tycon, red is Stainless Bros, blue is Alucon, which is their new aluminum line, and then black is Tycon as well. So the thing we're going to use the green marker is I've always wanted a green permanent marker, but never had one, so we'll make use of that. So the first thing that needs to happen with these collectors are both of these 4-foot sticks need to be cut in half. And then each 2-foot section, or 3 of them I should say, will be fed into my collector cutting jig, and geometry and cuts and everything will be applied to them, which we'll go over in a moment. But to start, let's go ahead, section these, and then we can start with the actual fun part. So with the 1.5-inch tube sections now sectioned, I'm ready to go ahead and start cutting the actual collector pieces. So I've shown it before, but as a refresher for those of you who haven't been around the channel for that long, this is my collector cutting fixture. And yes, it looks a bit haggard and a bit janky, and frankly it is, but it's done the job for thousands of collector pieces at this point in time, and it will continue to do the job for this one. So the high points of the wave tops of this are, we have a 2-inch piece of schedule pipe that anything up to 2-inch tubing or 1.5-inch pipe will slide through. It has 2 set bolts on the bottom. This one is slotted so I can pivot the whole collector cutting assembly back and forth to alter the splay angle between collector pieces. It has a set bolt here that holds the actual piece of tube or pipe, the material that's being cut into it. And there are little dimples of weld on either side of the piece of material that's being cut on both sides of this 2-inch schedule pipe piece, just to hold the piece being cut centered in here. So beyond that, what you need is a tape measure and some sort of a gauge to judge the rotation of the tube. I use this particular one from Trick Tools, which I will include a link in the comments below, the pinned comment, about this particular gauge. And it's just a simple analog bubble tube rotation level, essentially. And this will tell you when you are rotating the piece for the second cut, how far you've rotated it, and if you meet the spec for that particular collector piece. So in talking about the spec, if I'm making a circular 3-into-1 collector, well, what would the rotation between cuts be? So the way that I think about it is I will make one index cut, in this instance at 0 degrees, And from there, where do you go? Well, it seems much more complicated than it actually is. And let me grab a collector piece, or a collector, so I can more easily explain this. And what I'm doing is cutting a collector like this. So again, I guess it's kind of triangular rather than being flat across. But if you sit and think about this, and the fact that it more or less is just a triangle, you could have a point in the center here, center here, center here. It's a triangle. And a triangle is comprised of how many degrees? It's 180. So if you have 3 pieces and you need to get to 180 degrees overall, then that would end up being 60 degrees for the cut. So these kind of circular or triangular 3-into-1 collectors, they're based off of 60 degrees. Something like this 4-into-1 collector is based off of 360 degrees. You can see the outlet's kind of a circle. So these would be 90 degrees between cuts. So again, if we look at this, I guess it kind of looks like a square, center, 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 center. That makes a square, and a square, each one of the angles will be 90 degrees to get you to 360 overall. So when you can think of it in those terms, the geometry and the math behind it goes from being some sort of mystical dark art to something that is easy to wrap your head around and easy to figure out the math for, at least for most simple collectors like that. They can get more complicated, but for most of, if not the vast majority of the collectors that you will be working on, or that most of us work on, that math works out pretty easily. So let me go ahead. I'll get the 6 collector pieces cut, then we can part them and move on to the next step. After yesterday's labor, we now have both of the Mark II's primary collectors ready for finish welding. So these are what we ended up with. And they're both the same, so I'll just show one for an example. But we have 1.5" tube 3-into-1s. These go down and flare out to 2 inches at the bottom, and then they go into that 2-inch to 2.5-inch transitional cone. So that's the inside there. They come to a pretty nice point, and if you see the burrs and everything on the inside, that is typically how I leave these collectors, or any collectors, at this state. So it would be easy to look at it and go, well, that guy's a hack, why did it need to burr it completely? Well, there's a good reason for it. So anytime you are building parts or doing any type of work, it's always a balancing act between doing as good of a job as you can and having diminishing returns with your efforts and your labor. So with all the collectors that I've built, this is the point that I've arrived at. So the reason that I leave the burrs on the inside of it like that is because I'm going to weld the inside of the collector. Now, I could deburr it and everything like that, but that takes a good amount of time to do it and to have it be absolutely crystal clear and crystal clean. And frankly, it just really isn't worth the effort and the trouble to do that. If you come in and weld the inside of it, all of those burrs get melted away and melted into the little weld puddle that will be going on in there, and they will not be there by the time the collector is ready to go into service. So you guys certainly can go and clean up the insides of them and make them perfect and pretty and everything, but bear in mind that if you're welding the inside of it, it really isn't all that necessary, and you can save yourself a bunch of time in the process. Now, that isn't to say that any deburring is unnecessary. There are points that are necessary. So something like this, where the cone mates up to the bottom of the collector, that is deburred. And I deburr where each of the respective collector inlet tubes, in this case, would mate to each other. So that way there's no interference between them to make them fit properly. It's just on the inside where it isn't really causing an issue right now, and it will not cause an issue in the future by the time everything is melted together. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that's a little tip that can help you guys in the future. It takes a little bit of attention to detail and diligence to weld them correctly on the inside so there aren't any leftover straggling burrs that could make their way into your turbo. But if you do it correctly and have a good system of quality control in place, then you won't cause yourself any issues that way. So at this point, the only thing left to do is to go ahead and weld these collectors together. So let's go ahead and get after it. A little bit of welding later, and we now have two completed primary collectors for the Mark II's new turbo header. So these things came out pretty nicely, and they're welded obviously on the outside, they're welded on the inside, and we have full penetration on this butt weld right here. So everything is good to go with them. And you can see that welding the inside, there's no longer any burrs, or there are no longer any burrs or anything like that to contend with on the inside of them. So these are both good to go, and all we're waiting on at this point is a head flange, and then I can start making pretty quick work of building the new header for this car. But with that being said, and a pretty good episode, one of them I'm pretty happy with so far, I think that'll be about the end of this one. So a lot of information in this one. Hopefully it helps you guys, and hopefully some of the geometry for collector building makes a little bit more sense now. And there's a bunch of other different nuances and everything else to it, but I tried my best to hit kind of the wave tops of what is necessary to take just some raw tubing or piping and turn it into a functional part. So that's one of the most neat portions of doing this type of work, and one of the things that I get the most enjoyment out of. But with that being said, it'll be about the end of this one, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you guys, as always, for tuning in, for coming on all these different journeys with me, all these different adventures, and all these different projects. Having a lot of fun with all this stuff, and having a lot of fun putting this car back together. So I have a lot to look forward to in the next upcoming episodes with this thing. But that'll be then. This is now, and this one is all but completed. So as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, check out the website for manifolds, for merch, for all things good that way, and I will see you all in the next episode.